I went to the PDF for it.
It's a pleasure to see quite a number of people here. This is Global Politics 8505. As the students of the class, which now they're just less than a half, I think, knows, one of the major themes of this class is the connection between various changes in civilization. We start from the urban, the cultural revolution, the urban revolution. We mentioned something about the print revolution. And I think that the digital revolution, the rise of computers, is one of those unique moments in the history of civilization which has consequences far and beyond the invention itself. And ultimately it has impact on governance itself. And that's, as you know, part of the theme of this class. I've been very, very honored to have one of the best experts on this issue to have today with us as a guest lecturer. This is Dr. Linton Wells. Dr. Wells has held various kind of civilian leadership positions in the National Security Affairs as Senior Executive Service, or equivalent, for over 20 years. This includes service as Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for Networks and Information Technologies, and the Department of Defense Chief Information Officer. And in these both roles, he was part of the system that oversees the U.S. Defense Department $30 billion budget for information technology. Dr. Wells was, when he left federal service in June 2014, he joined us, the cyber initiative here at MIIS, which my colleague and my friend Ida Lockhart, he's the director. Before that, last 4 years before that, he was running this at the Center for Technology and National Security Policy at the National Defense University. He ran that center, and he was also the Transformation Chair and a Distinguished Research Professor. So we're talking about accumulated knowledge of some 50 years. I've had the pleasure to sit with Dr. Wells in a number of lunches and breakfasts, and he is a truly Renaissance man. So he was agreed to give us a talk, which was introductory but also visionary, on a theme that fits us and fits the initiative, the challenge of the digital revolution in global governance.
Thank you very much. So you all should have a one-page sheet in front of you. There's some down here, just to summarize what we're going to talk about a little bit, and then for you to take notes on. And so the first point is that technology is not just for geeks. Increasingly they're having strategic effects and should be considered as strategic issues. And these are things not just in information technology, but they're accelerating, converging technological revolutions in areas such as biotechnology, robotics and autonomous systems, information and cognitive science, nanotechnology, energy. Think brine, bio, robo, info, nano energy. These things are converging, but they affect the winners and losers in economies, they affect the way nations interact, and more importantly, they affect the way our children think. So these are issues for policymakers and strategists and commanders, not just for the technical folks. These also raise fundamental legal, moral, ethical policy issues. And frankly, the legal and policy frameworks are not keeping up with the technology. So how do we find a way to adapt to what's going on out there? In addition, there are near-term decisions that can shape long-term outcomes. For example, the engagement in international standards bodies, what the future standards of data sharing are going to be, who's going to govern the internet, what the acceptable sharing of biotechnology information is going to be. All of these are near-term decisions that are going on now. They're going to have profound 20, 30, 40 years impacts. And unfortunately, the United States is largely, I won't say abrogating, but it's reducing its presence in these bodies and turning it over to other countries. And China in particular is playing a very aggressive role in this. And we'll talk about later on, linear projections cannot be the basis for future policy or guidance. Things are changing too fast. So those are kind of the overviews of what I want to talk about today. But then some of the things I'd like to ask you to consider as you think about it. So how does technology in general, and digital technology in particular, is what we're talking about today, drive global change and the global political issues that you're dealing with in this course? And you can't just look at the technology. You have to consider people and processes and organizations and technology interacting with each other. No one solution is going to do it. Then where is the innovation and investment coming from? Lots of times governments say, we're in charge of all this stuff. Well, in point of fact, the vast majority of innovation and investment is going on outside there in the private sector. So how does government intersect with that? How do you build the public-private partnerships to allow you to do this effectively? And then how do the present governance techniques, so what governance have you got? You got political, you got military, you got diplomatic, you got legislative, you got executive, judicial, international organizations. How do they function in these environments with the tech moving so quickly? And we'll use the digital revolution as an example for this. So, what issues should you be most concerned about in this? And then how much influence can leaders have? So those are kind of the broad questions I like to think about. And then the other things I'd like you as students to think about are these questions down there at the bottom. Are we in fact developing the right leaders and the right workforce, not just leaders, the workforce, to operate effectively in this future digital environment? Second, do judges, legislators, policymakers understand these issues that they're being asked to adjudicate or decide about? And how can we make them better stewards of the issues they're being asked to maintain? And then what should you be learning as students in whatever concentrations or programs you're in about this digital revolution? If you're going to go to work for Sony, which is just, of course, suffered these really serious hacks, how much should you, how digitally fluent should you be? You don't have to be into zeros and ones, you don't have to be a computer information system security professional, but you should be able to at least talk the language to understand that this is important to your company and important to the way things go. So those are kind of the broad issues I'd like to talk about. I plan to talk for maybe 10 or 12 minutes, and each time then stop and then talk with you, get your feedback and some of your questions. I'm not going to go on for an hour and a half. So I look very much to have this an interactive session. Okay, so with this as background then, think about the evolving national security environment. So there's a lot of talk about transformation. So what is transformation? It's a process that shapes the changing nature of competition, collaboration, and conflict, and innovation management across these people, across these organizations, technology. Ideally, you want it to provide an enduring competitive advantage. Point of fact, things are changing so rapidly there almost never will be an enduring competitive advantage. What you have to have is your processes, and you have to outthink the opponent. You have to be more agile than they are. And how do you set up the processes in order to cross that? So in the military area, people talk about three broad types of transformation. There is military innovation, which typically is tactical, driven by combat, bottom up. So think countering improvised explosive devices in Afghanistan. There's something called a revolution in military affairs, which typically at operational level takes place over decades. So think the development of carrier aviation in the 30s and 30s, development of previous warfare, development of blitzkrieg. And then the military revolution, which is when the processes and technologies of society are changing so rapidly that the military is scrambling to catch up. So the Industrial Revolution was one such time in the 1800s. I would argue that we're in that kind of period today. So a couple of years ago, we did a study for the Office of Secretary of Defense called Trends and Shocks. And the basic point was, if you look at the crash of '29, you look at Pearl Harbor, you look at Sputnik, you look at the fall of the wall, you look at 9/11, these were shocks, but they were the product of trends. And so if you can understand what those trends were, you might have a better chance of anticipating and perhaps mitigating the shocks. So out of this study, we came up with sort of 6 broad areas of focus. One is demographics. And demographics is an area that we often pay much too little attention to. The second is environment and energy. The third is economics. The fourth is a very interesting area of identity, culture, and governance. which basically is the extent to which today with the internet and the digital world, the diasporas, for example, can collaborate in ways that people distributed around the world can never do. It's a way that super empowered individuals can have enormous impact. ISIS being an example, a few terrorist bombers here and there, have enormous impacts on policy. The fifth area is the nature of conflict, and the sixth is science and technology. So these six broad areas. So demographics, energy and environment, economics, identity, culture and governance, nature of conflict, and S&T. But within the S&T, I mentioned the information technology, the digital revolution, is changing the winners and losers economies, the way nations interact, and the way the next generation of workforce thinks, the human capital. So these are clearly issues for policymakers and ambassadors to manage. Now, if computing power per unit cost doubles about every 18 months, which it is, that means in a year and a half, you have 3% more capability. But in 5 years, you have 98% more. And in 10 years, you have 10,000% more. There's no way that a linear extrapolation from where you are today is going to reflect the future you're going to be living in. So what does that mean? But in addition, biotech is changing faster than than information. The cost of sequencing the human genome is down 6 orders of magnitude, 1 million times in 10 years. Robotics and autonomous vehicles are becoming ubiquitous. Cognitive science is the renaissance. Nanotechnology is coming to be part of all sorts of things, and energy underpins everything. Even back to that Brian framework, bio-global energy. So all sorts of things are happening, accelerating, converging together. There is, I think, in the website, the cyber website, a PowerPoint presentation that will be on strategic impacts of accelerating technological change that goes through in detail, in more detail, what some of these is happening in each of these areas. And I won't go through that today, but you can get a chance if you're interested to see what synthetic biology is happening, what's happening with its highly energetic explosives, and what's happening with brain mapping and that kind of thing. So I think the trends are pushing towards this military revolution, where defense, at least, is maybe scrambling to catch up. But this kind of change has been here for a long time. If you were the defense planner in the world's greatest power in 1900, you would have been a Brit looking at your age-old enemy, France. By 1910, you'd be allied with France, the enemy would be Germany. By 1920, World War I has come and gone, and you're a naval arms race with your erstwhile allies, the U.S. and Japan. By 1930, the Great Depression is here, naval arms limitation treaties are in effect, and your defense planning standard says no war for 10 years. 9 years later, World War II is by 1950, everything has changed. You're no longer the world's greatest power. It's the atomic age. The United Nations didn't exist as engaged in the land war in Asia. By 1960, the nuclear paradigm is shifting from massive retaliation to flexible response. The U.S. election tunes in on talk of bomber gaps and missile gaps, and very few people have ever heard of Vietnam. By 1970, the peak of our involvement in Vietnam has come and gone. The British are withdrawing east of Suez. And so we look for a surrogate, and we pick the Shah of Iran, and it's détente with the Soviet Union. In 1980, the Soviets are in Afghanistan, the Shah is toast, and everyone talks about a hollow post-Vietnam American military. By 1990, that military is within a decade, within a year of showing the strong anything but hollow. The Soviet Union for the year of falling apart, and almost no one's heard of the internet. So by 2000, the U.S. is the world's hyperpower. All sorts of things are going on. The enormous economic power, and almost no one's ever heard of Al-Qaeda. So here in 2010, recession. People are worried about energy prices going through the roof. No one's ever heard of ISIS. My point is, I have no clue what 2020 is going to look like. I would just about guarantee it's going to be nothing like what you think it's going to be. And so you need to factor that kind of thinking into your planning. And especially you juxtapose on this the non-linear acceleration of technology. It's going to be a very exciting world. So let me stop there for a minute and ask for your thoughts. You may have a thought or a question or a comment on that. Because if you don't, I'm going to ask you. Sir?
I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but you mentioned in these 5 5 issues, the nature of conflict. When I get conflict, what do you mean by the nature of conflict?
So there's a lot of talk about the extent to which technology is changing warfare. There's an equal amount of discussion that says that war is inherently human endeavor, that is basically the imposition of will by politics by another means. And so whether it's done with nuclear weapons or whether it's done precision-guided munitions or swords, spears, and crossbows, there's an inherent underlying nature. And so that's kind of what the debate is about. To what extent is transformation changing the nature of war versus all you techie guys get along, we've got to focus on the human factors. Ma'am?
The main theme here is that the world is changing very quickly and unpredictably. And so as future policymakers, how can we address that issue to create proactive rather than reactionary policies if we can't even fathom what the world will look like?
Well, so I think the first point is to make an effort to make yourselves not into scientists, technologists, but at least digitally literate or technologically literate. It is frankly astonishing in my various years in government the extent to which many policymakers are terrified of numbers. And this may reflect the fact there's so many lawyers in the high or congressional staffers, whatever, but when at one point I used to work in a part of the government, part of the Office of Secretary of Defense called Program Analysis and Evaluation. And so we did budget analyses and things like that. And my particular account was Northeast Asia, right? Japan, Korea, things like that. So the Office of the International Secretary for International Security Affairs was the State Department of the Pentagon. And they would prepare almost all the policy papers going up to the Secretary. Well, the Secretary at that point was Harold Brown, who was a physicist. So he liked numbers. And so the deal I struck was I would go down to the policy people and say, well, what's coming up in the next few weeks, months? And they say, oh, the Japanese defense minister is visiting in 3 weeks. So I'd go down and put some kind of analysis together, and I'd give it to them for them to include in their paper. And so I'd get my analysis up. They'd get a paper that they'd like to read because it had numbers in it. And it was symbiotically happy. One of the things we've been trying to do, there's a very interesting program that the Department of Justice has run for a while on how to make judges more technically literate. It's called ASTAR, Advanced Science Technology Adjudication Resource, but it doesn't matter. And so what this is, and the one I was involved in was biotech. And so this Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court would designate a group of judges or judge to hear bio cases. He would come to a 3-day, they call it boot camp, where the judges would get together, and the first day was spent talking about the state of precedent and practice, so the state of technology and like the evolution of technology in this field. The second day would focus on the state of precedent and practice in the law, and where the gap was between the law and science. Then they would focus on things like how can you square the circle. So here's an expert witness. This is what an expert witness could do for you, Judge. And these are some questions that you might ask to determine if that expert witness is qualified. Then they go off and do about 120 hours of distance learning, and then come back for another one-day wrap-up and get a certificate, which the state chief justice could then use to say, I'll assign those kind of courses to judge whatever. So the point, the long answer to your question is, what can you do to make yourselves more digitally literate, technically literate? Because just a simple case, anybody know what a MOOC is? Okay, a massively open online course. And so last summer I took a MOOC on mapping and the geospatial revolution. It was offered by Coursera, which is out of Stanford, prof out of Penn State. 5 weeks, free, roughly 5 hours a week. It was one of the most intense and interesting courses I've ever been to, because it was all built on student discovery. And so instead of saying, you know, droning on with a PowerPoint presentation I'm reading to you, it would say, you know, based on the tools we've taught you, how has your neighborhood changed to become more or less vulnerable to flooding over the past 30 years because of changes in demographics or paving over paving over feeder streams, stuff like that. 47,000 students from 102 countries, of which 34,000 finished. And I mean, their classmates, so the prof starts talking in YouTube. And one of the students says, you know, Prof, YouTube censored my country. I'll go and take your course. Hours, somebody weighs in and says, censorship censored my country too. Let me show you how to get my YouTube censored. Somebody else weighs in and says, hey, let's do anonymous email. Here's Hushmail. Somebody else goes, do the deep web. Here's Tor. So there are people in Hyderabad and Sao Paulo I would love to meet that I got involved in this course. My only point is that this idea of lifelong, continuous learning supported by point-of-need content delivery works in your favor. And so if you have the interest and motivation to want to try to learn this stuff, it's out there. Sir?
Kind of building on Elizabeth's point about it being very difficult to stay in front of issues that we don't even know yet.
Right.
In regards to military transformation, I assume that adaptability and flexibility are very important components as we move forward. I was wondering what suggestions you would have for the military to become more adaptable, whether it's structurally or the way they educate or we educate our soldiers. If you think that there need to be significant changes, whether it's in the types of equipment that we have or the way that our units are structured.
So 2 points. First one, there needs to be a fundamental change in the way the military does education. So the military typically divides learning into training, experiential learning, on-the-job training, and education. And training and education are typically brick and mortar school activities, and the experiential learning is out in the field. And so what we're trying to do in my center before I left, we established the innovative learning process to try to take advantage of the explosion of innovation that's going on in private sector adult education and apply it to national security learning. So MOOCs and gaming and advanced distributed learning and things like that. So my own sense is, you know, how do you get to the stage of, first of all, you motivate people to recruitment to retirement, lifelong learning. There used to be in the advisory committee of the Johns Hopkins School of Engineering. And we would teach our students that by the time you graduate, half of what you learned your first 2 years would be obsolete. So it does you no good to have a sheepskin on the wall if you haven't continued to stay current. So the methodology is there to do it. So in the military, how do you get people to commit to this and then provide them tools for this learning? So I mean, I come back from Afghanistan and reset, oh my God, I'm finally get home. And you sit there and somebody says, okay, West Africa, Ebola. I can't go to Leavenworth for 4 months and learn about this. I can't go to whatever. So how do you get them that information in time for them to get something? So that's one point. The other is, there's a really excellent book about the Imperial Japanese Navy called Kaibu, which is the story of the Imperial Navy from the Meiji Restoration up through 1945. So it's 1941. So it's development history, not a battle history. And what it concludes on the advent of World War II is the Japanese Navy was brilliantly prepared for battle and not prepared for war. And because things like logistics, anti-submarine warfare, shipbuilding, all kinds of stuff, were just not in the equation. So I read a really interesting paper a couple of weeks ago called "The Time to Tweet as Well as the Time to Kill." And it's the story of ISIL's use of social media. And it was written by a senior professor and a graduate student. And I would argue that nobody older than the graduate student could have written that paper, because it's intimately involved with, intimately aware of social media and anonymizing Facebook posts and things like that. So if you think through the wars today, are increasingly fought in one of the living rooms of the electorates of the countries providing the forces. How do you engage that? I mean, F-35s are great, BC-1000s are great, main battle tanks are great. It doesn't fight that war. And so when you talk about how does the war change, how the military change, things like that, I think we need to be able to operate in that space in the way we have done before.
So I'm going to build off of this question. At what point do you believe it's responsible for the U.S. military to begin maybe branching off One of the primary reasons why we lost so many people in World War I, because generals were not able to get their heads around the concept that there was a trench and that you could not just have these massive attacks, frontal assaults on other turrets, on machine gun posts. So at what point are we going to be hit with cyber attack when we actually dedicate a dedicated force against the cyber threat? Currently we have cyber, at least in the Army, divided up in between several different branches of the force. And so how is it, at what point do we say enough is enough, this is a new arena of battle, and organize ourselves in order to have one unified front in that battle?
So, first of all, I would argue, get back to this in a minute, with the cyber mission force, you get the 6,300 people added under the different teams that are being put out for the protection of the national networks, the protection of the critical infrastructure, the operation of the military networks, and then conduct of military operations, which could involve offensive activities. There at least is a structure there that has people divided up into assignments. Some go to the combatant command, some stay at Fort Meade, some operate in support of Department of Homeland Security, things like that. So 2 years ago that didn't exist, that construct didn't exist. Now, how the services organize, train, and equip, provide those, I think the service is still struggling. The Navy has just combined N2 and N6, the intelligence community communicators, together. I mean, obviously, bitter debates over whether intelligence and communications people should work together, and they have knife fights and all that stuff. As you say, the Army is still wrestling with it. So I think it will be a while before we catch up, but I think actually overall the structure of a cyber mission force has now been defined much better than we've ever had it before. So we're getting there, I think, on it. Now, going back to the revolution of military affairs, I think, the prerequisites for a successful military revolution in military affairs were really sixfold. There had to be a group of theoreticians who thought broad thoughts, which was the role of war colleges filled in the 30s. There had to be a group of practitioners who went out and did exercises, as I'm there had to be a link between the practitioners, the theoreticians, and the acquisition community so you could buy what you needed. There had to be some kind of a high-level advocate, Billy Mitchell, Admiral Moffat, Admiral Rick Over, or something like that, whose job was partly to get resources, but particularly to keep the heat off the mid-level people who were doing all the innovative work. The budget had to be in rough proportion to where the potential offered by the capability, but there had to be a personnel system to grow the battalion commanders and the squadron commanders, things like that, so that 20 years from now, when this became mainstream, we had people who knew how to operate. So I'd argue in the past couple of years, we're beginning to get our heads around the personnel system. But as you say, it's the implementation still has to be. Sir? Yeah.
With so many different divisions within the military, but I guess this is a multi-layered question, but what are the platforms for information sharing or sharing of lessons learned, both on the civilian side and the government side? I know that in regards to cybersecurity, it'd be very unlikely that governments would share lessons learned from breaches like you mentioned Sony at the beginning of class. Are there any online or conference-like platforms where governments, either internationally or domestically, can share lessons learned or are willing to do so?
So actually internationally, I would refer to Ida, who knows this pretty well, but domestically, the bag is definitely mixed. Okay? So first we're going to get different levels of classification. Okay? I think there's actually not a bad sharing of information at the SCI, Sensitive Department of Information level, within channels like the intelligence community channels. That said, a couple of years ago, mid-2000s, the concept was something called need to know. And you only got access if you could clearly demonstrate the need. And after 9/11, there was increasingly moved to need to share. So in order to avoid the stovepiping that led to the failure to share information in 9/11, there was a sense of need to share. And a lot of progress was being made in that until Bradley Manning and Snowden. And so what's happened is the result of both of those two, Manning in particular led to a cutting off almost entirely of State Department sharing a lot of the diplomatic cables with the DoD, and Snowden, of course, led just to tightening down of all sorts of stuff. So this is going to be a sawtooth. It's not going to be a continuous monotonically increasing function. With regard to, I think in some respects the more important piece is industry and government. In the late 1990s, there was a document called Presidential Decision Directive, PD 63, which dealt with the protection of critical infrastructure in the United States. And PD 63 set up a series of things called ISACs, Information Sharing and Analysis Centers. And the idea was that this was a place where industry could all sign non-disclosure agreements, come together, work with government, and understand better what was going on. So this was across the whole range of critical infrastructure. So it was not just cyber, it was transportation, banking, and energy, and things like that. So the ISACs, frankly, have been a very mixed bag of success. Some have worked fairly well, financially worked pretty well. But by and large, especially in the IT space, the vast majority of innovation and investment is actually going on in the private sector. And yet the government still thinks it owns it. And so, a couple of years ago I went up to Bedminster, New Jersey, which is where AT&T has its law lines. And it's eye-watering large screen displays. And these folks know down to every 15 seconds what the average loading of the networks is going to be. They can detect anomalous behavior like that. And they said, look, suppose we really screw this up. So suppose we really get badly hacked. You governors think you can come in here and run this for us? You can't. You might be able to tell us something about what's happening and tell us what, but you can't do this. And yet, every time we want to have a partnership meeting, you invite us down to Washington, and we have a big long table, and all the industry folk who own the infrastructure and pay the bills sit on the side, and government people say, hey, do you not understand the message you're trying to send? So part of the way to get around this was what the president tried to do last Friday at Stanford with the summit. And they set up these new things called ISAOs, or Information Sharing and Analysis Organizations. And they've now set up this CTIC, the Counter Cyber Threat Intelligence Center, Integration Center. So it remains to be seen whether or not this will actually learn the lessons from PD 63. It's another bite of kind of the same apple, and I hope they make progress, but we can't do it without them. Okay, let me go back to the next piece. So Tom Friedman is working on a new book. And the title of the book is basically The World is Fast. And what he's looking at is the biggest challenge we're facing today, which is the resilience of our workers, the environment, and our institutions, the challenge we're facing. So in his view, there are three drivers of the change. And in his shorthand, one is the market. One is, which is to say, globalized and low cost of entry and flat. The second is Mother Nature, which is to say climate change. And the third is Moore's Law, which is to say the accelerated technology. He describes this in terms of the famous story about paying for the game of chess, where the king says, how much it's going to cost me, and there's 1 grain of rice on the first square, 2 on the second, 4 on the third, 8 on the fourth, so on and so forth. Not really get the second half of the chessboard, you realize what price this is going to be. And in his shorthand, in all three of these areas, the globalizing, flattening the market, climate change, and technological change, they enter the second half of this. The other point he makes concerns makers and breakers. So in this world, it's easier to both make and break things. The cost of entry for entrepreneurs in the market is near zero in IT and additive manufacturing and things like that. And the penalties for failing are pretty low. So you can get in there and do things. But the problem is it's actually much easier to break things now than it is particularly in global policy these days. It's much easier to stymie and tear things down than it is to build institutions. And the point he makes, there's a famous poem from Yeats about when things fall apart, the center cannot hold, the best lose all conviction, or the worst will fill with passion. Yes. And his point, which is written by global, and his point today is what we need is a passionate center. We see a political process that drives to extreme, passionate extremes. The center is really pretty weak. So how can you create, and this is for you, how can you create the conditions for a passionate center that believes you've got to work together to make more than great? So an area that really, really bothers me is the national security implications. Is that better?
Yes.
National security implications of the coming workforce crisis. And there was a terrific report in The Economist last fall on the impact of technology in the global economy. It's about last October. It's about a 51-page entry. And it's supplemented or reinforced by two TED Talks. One is by a guy named Rainer Schratz, who's a German, talking about the workforce crisis of 2030 and how to start addressing it now. And this juxtaposes workforce demographics and the differential impacts of technology. So what these together are saying is something like this. Okay, in 2030, you've got a little batch of aging baby boomers. And so Schratz is talking about from a German perspective. You're going to have more pensioners than you have productive workers. There's a higher ratio of pensioners than workers. That's fine. Certain social tensions from that. But this question is, how is technology going to affect this? So one model is, again, you've got enormous opportunities for those who are motivated and those who are talented to start new businesses and invent new things and change the marketplace and really do very well for themselves. But anybody to the left of center on the bell curve is not going to have much of a chance to participate. And then even those to the right of center, people will be sort of befuddled by technology or, who moved my cheese, not going to want to participate. So the net result of it's going to increase the winners and losers, differentiation in the winners and losers economies. And you couple with this with the accelerating rate of machine learning. And people are seriously talking about 20 to 25% structural unemployment in the OECD world and the United States by 2030. So what does that mean for the American dream? What does that mean for youth attitudes if we're like Spain? And they just come out of college and what do you go? But what does it mean particularly, going back to the demographics piece in the first part, for the youth bulges in sub-Saharan Africa and the Islamic world? I mean, this would be a knowledge economy. We have enormous opportunity to succeed if you can play. But for those who just have basic levels of education, when production line workers and certain white-collar jobs and all this are being replaced by automation, what is the opportunity for these people? There is a serious chance out there for lots of folks with pitchforks in the streets and the kind of social change as a result of these, the juxtaposition of demographics and technological change. And I don't know anybody who's really paying much attention to this. Some folks are just beginning to write about it. I'm using this as I teach a class every spring on wicked problems. But that's going to be a set piece of my class this year, is how do you get people in the national security space to begin thinking about this. And then there's another TED Talk by Jeremy Howard called The Wonderful and Terrifying Implications of Computers for Learning. And he then superimposes the velocity of which computer learning is going on, machine learning is going on. And his point is that historically, when you've introduced new technology, it's been an S-curve. Funny. But the problem is right now the machines are learning exponentially, and there's no indication of a level off. So what happens when you take the demographics, the job replacement, the increasing rate of learning in machines, what's the answer for that? I don't know, but I think it's an issue. And there's a lot of talk about you got to train leaders, got it, and that's clearly important. But how do you provide adequate opportunities to get a job, raise a family, how to satisfy a life for the people in the middle. One of the points Tom Friedman made, the middle class used to be a destination. Now it's a journey. So, anyway, so those are, you know, some of the thoughts in there between Friedman and this. So again, let me stop there and open to your thoughts. This would be your world, particularly your children's world. Come back over. Yes, sir.
So, in terms of what the focus is going to be for us humans, not machines, that are,
right.
The focus is going to be on breadth. Should it be learning breadth, learning depth? If machines or if automation will be able to take care of any need for me to know any information, besides critical thinking, what other skills then will become?
That's what I mean. I think critical thinking is clearly a point. So in terms of workforce development, for example, if you're going to hire somebody to do the company for a long period of time, instead of hiring someone with really deep, narrow skill sets now, I'd be more interested in somebody with agility. Because the job they may be doing in 10 years may have nothing to do with the job they're doing now. And the last thing I want is somebody to say, well, wait a minute, I was hired to do X, and anything X plus, you know, any change is not my job. That's one. The second, I think you've got to outthink your opponent. How can you put together as leaders a decision process that's more agile and nimble than the competition's? Because it's always going to be changing. How do you not bog yourself down with bureaucratic rules and things like that? And it's coming from the government, believe me, I know the bureaucratic rules. How do you change those processes? Because lots of times, governmental processes in particular are designed to avoid mistakes, not designed to, innovate. So how do you keep from wasting the taxpayers' money? I got it, that's important. But in the process, you lose out the ability to make some of these changes. So I think those are some of the things I would look for.
Thanks, Lynn. So I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit.
Sure.
So we've seen other types of technological changes
Right.
that have been very major,
Right.
impacted societies. And the same kinds of questions have happened as,
Yep.
well, what happens to the populace? How are we going? It's moving much faster.
Mm-hmm.
Population is growing, or less food, less economics. And I'm curious as to how much, I mean, I know my point of view, but how much of what we're facing now in terms of youth bulge, in terms of loss of employment, that argument that Friedman is making, how much of that is reality, or is it just part of the process of evolution that we've gone through before?
Yeah, I think that's perfectly fair. I mean, certainly these are the Luddite arguments from the Industrial Revolution and all that. So the first change is replacing farm workers with farm jobs and moving them basically to mills and factories and things like that. And this is where you come back again to the S curve of the technological introduction. You have a lot of change very quickly, but finally it stabilizes. And with a reasonable level of stable education, so high school or even 8th grade education, you can get a job in a manufacturing situation that can provide a reasonable living for your family, things like that. And the question here is, to what extent is the replacement of labor by capital, in this case smart capital, happening so quickly that people are not able to adjust? All right? So in the 1820s and 30s were traumatic times in England as people moved off the farms and the factories, and then you had almost a century of awful labor conditions and people working under terrible working conditions and Haymarket riots and that kind of thing. But eventually it leads you to sort of a stable middle class, punctuated by things like the Great Depression. But at least people understand what it is. And so the question here now is this: if Friedman's right in the middle class journey, middle class wages have been essentially flat since the 70s. And productivity per worker has been going up quite dramatically because of capital replacement, but the worker hasn't really benefited from that. And now that you've got, if I were a paralegal, for example, I'd be really worried because why does my lawyer need to have me go out and search all the cases when he doesn't have Watson do it in a fraction of the time or something like that. So I think the question is it qualitatively different? It's a perfectly valid question to ask that says, okay, given this velocity of change, 900% in 5 years, 10,000% in 10 years, given the fact that I really encourage you to look at these two TED Talks. They're only about 18 minutes each. And just see how you would fit it into the traditional model of, okay, what level of education would my children need in order to provide a middle-class wage for their families? So there's a lot of talk here about what's the role of the education system. And clearly, I think everybody understands this K-12 education system is not producing workers who are suited to this modern workforce. And so there's been a lot of talk about the German system, which basically is much more vocational school-oriented thing, using community colleges for that kind of thing. And so there's some very interesting partnerships. For example, Boeing, I'm told, is partnering with the Puget Sound Community Colleges, stuff like that. Because Boeing is making more and more of the aircraft out of composite fibers. And almost no vocational programs are teaching people how to work with composite fibers. So what this community college did is we will put together a genuinely world-class 2-year program in composite fibers, and Boeing agrees to hire almost every graduate. So what other opportunities are out there, I mean, across the full range of things that aren't going to be supplanted simply? So the point is perfectly valid. I mean, it's an unproved hypothesis. It just, the more you look at this pace of technological change, and just how hard it is to keep track, just how hard it is to keep, and the change provides infinite opportunities. There's no doubt that some people are going to thrive in this environment. The issue is not those who are not, the issue is not this lack of opportunity for some. The issue is how you avoid further dividing the economy into winners and losers. At the same time, when Davos talks about 1% of the population next year controlling 50% of the world's wealth, that can't be a position for stable environments. The last piece is I'm reading a book right now called The Age of Betrayal, which is basically the dominance of monopoly capitalism in late 19th century Gilded Age America. And it's people have their cottages in Newport, and some people are thriving. The majority of people live in slums and working 12-day work weeks, 6 days a week. And yet, somewhere between 1900 and about 1950, through the combination of muckraking journalism and Roosevelt and Taft and antitrust and things like that, there were significant changes. And the question is there something one could do, is there some hope in the present political system to make those kind of changes? But for me, the critical part of this is participatory capitalism. So Henry Ford basically says, I'm willing to pay my workers $5 a day so they can buy my cars. And that's the piece I don't see in a lot of the present success stories, is how do you recognize the fact that a stable, vibrant middle class is actually going to make you more money in the long run and be key to the society than just getting off the meat. So that, I think, are some of the key policy questions. Yes, one, two.
The detail. You mentioned 2 TED Talks. One was
Two TED Talks?
2 TED Talks right here, Stack, and then
Jeremy Howard. Jeremy Howard's on learning machines, and The Economist, like October, it's an insert called Technology in the World Economy.
Does Thomas Friedman talk at all about bio-digital immigration?
Not in our conversation so far. I mean, I've talked a fair amount about this, but not that particular. He's talking about Moore's Law as a shorthand for the generic acceleration of technology. But, so one of the questions I like to ask engineering students is, what technology do you think your children are going to use to befuddle you to the same extent as you befuddle your parents? And usually the answer comes back as kind of the cyborgization of the human body. So some combination of bio, info, whatever, robotics. And so the way you irritate your parents in 20 years, you say, look at the tab I got, is look at the chip I had implanted, or whatever. And I frankly think that's shooting way behind the rabbit, because the implantation of chips is not going to be 20 years out. By the time your kids grow up, it'll be way beyond that. I think you're right, the bio-info, it's just not, he may be thinking about it, just I haven't talked about it with him. And the book is still on ASOS. Right.
You briefly mentioned the German system, and I think
The what? German
system, and I think largely it's incompatible with the way that Americans think, just because of the way that it's structured. You're taking tests, and I think in 8th grade they kind of dictate where you're going. But what part of that, where we're trying to find solutions that maybe we can't find or are unachievable for an issue that may actually just require an American change in perspective and relative concept of what the middle class is and what their ability to achieve, or our ability to achieve, should be. So how do you balance?
So go on. What would you?
Well, my question is where is that balance where we're working towards a problem that we necessarily can't solve because this is the direction we're going, and how do you bring society along to start to understand? Well, this is the highest level that you're going to be able to achieve, and a different perspective of what the middle class actually is.
So fair point, but I think it's actually much, much worse than that. Because, I mean, there is actually, globally, no way that sort of the 3 billion people who aspire to middle class status in China and India and whatever are going to be able to achieve American consumption rates or European consumption rates and have the planet sustain, at least with the way we're doing business now. And so we have a promise out there of a whole batch of people leaving aside what the story in America is, who are not going to be able to achieve that. And so what happens when they realize that this is not attainable? So I think there's a whole batch of societal adjustments that need to be made. Now, a couple of years ago I was in Istanbul, and it was obvious listening to CNN, BBC, Deutsche Welle, whatever, that only 3 things happened that week. Michael Jackson died. There was some grainy cell phone video from someplace claiming to be covering a riot in Iran, and was poisoned. And then at some point, the Michael Jackson story was replaced by a baby girl eaten by alligator in Florida. And my point is, we have a system here that's based on informed decisions by an informed electorate. And I don't know what the mechanisms in our information flow are to inform them about that. Theoretically, on the internet, we have access to the information resources of the world. But most of us, either RSS stuff or by our own predictions, go out and look for things that kind of reinforce things we're comfortable with. And I'm sure that I could find folks who live 24/7 in the world that is Holocaust deniers, or 24/7 in the world white supremacists, or whatever. And so I have an acquaintance who runs an Israeli-Palestinian news service. So he lives in Israel and covers both Israel and Palestine. And the mandate she has for her reporters is, every day you must spend an hour listening to someone with whom you viscerally disagree. So if you're an NPR person, you've got to listen to Rush and Glenn Beck, and vice versa. And it seems to me that's the only way to get to something. You've got to get outside your comfort zone and find out what's happening in areas that you're not familiar with. But I don't know how to cause the society as a whole to get there. And I'd certainly welcome ideas.
Yeah, going back to the reason I posed a question before, a lot of people I've talked to about this, and I agree with you about the rate of change,
Right.
but have been looking specifically at China.
Yeah.
And looking at 3D printing. Those of you I don't know, 3D printing is replicator, okay? Right. Like Star Trek. And what this will mean to factories and production in China specifically because of how much comes out of there and how large the population is. And the impact, even though it's not the West, will have devastating consequences and what happens when 3D printing takes over manufacturing, not just in terms of developing a middle class as a goal to sustain society, but in terms of trade, in terms of everything else that
Sure.
depends on.
Logistics, sales, yeah.
Right. And, you know, the debates I've heard, and I'd love to hear your point of view, have been, well, but some cases, small cases of, you know, we've all been concerned when the United States, for example, was very strong in automobile manufacturing, there was huge concern when it was moved to Latin America and other countries, and yet the solution is, well, we train, the goal is we train the workers to have other skills.
Right.
To a certain extent, it can and can't, it was and wasn't successful. But in a case like China, given the population and the factories and the amount of things that come out of it, that's where I've heard the major concern, and I'm not quite sure.
No, I
What
saw
you think?
some just the other week
Yeah.
that said that Taiwan is actually buying 1 million robots in order to replace 500,000 mainly Chinese workers for jobs. It was less expensive. And so I think clearly the jury is still out. But it seems to me that you can point to a historical basis. Every new technology has created about as many new jobs as it has displaced, and therefore Peter Drucker talked about the knowledge economy back in the 70s, and we're still more or less surviving. I just think that the pace of tech change and the convergence at least suggests we're entering a different period. And it may be, I mean, one of the things the Economist magazine says, it's not an impossible problem. Skillful public policy, skillful national and global politics can probably help us muddle our way through this. Unfortunately, we have not seen the skillful global national politics up to now. And so what's going to cause the political system to adapt to handle this new challenge, as opposed to entrenching in no more migrant workers or nationalism or whatever. So I would love to be disproved on this. I would love to have people come back in 10 years and say, Matt, you've all left. I just think the velocity of change at this point is so rapid that it's worth considering that this may be something. So, okay, so let's see if we can get this back now. Okay. So the question here is drivers of the digital revolution.
Just switch username.
It's never easy. So there's a guy, an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley named Bill Coleman. And he has written what's been for me one of the more thoughtful papers on this subject. It's called The Evolution of the Information Age. I think this will be up on the website. And what he talks about is the information age being divided into 30-year cycles punctuated by, each one punctuated by 10-year phases. And so,
I was suggesting he make it bigger so
made it
you
work.
can scroll up and
Good
down.
fix. Anyway, so it's 30 degrees, 30-year cycle is followed by 10-year phase. And the 10-year phase is always the same. It's innovation, it's invention, boom and bust, followed by smaller. So followed by build out and consolidation, and then followed by commoditization. So you get all three. So you start in the 60s, and so here's 60s, 70s, 80s, with semiconductors in Silicon Valley. So by the end of the 1970s, there were something like 70 semiconductor companies in Silicon Valley. By the end of the 1980s, sorry, the end of the 60s or 70s. By the end of the 1970s, there were about 7. So it went through its innovation boom, plus consolidation, and then eventually became commodities. But what they did was they empowered the next cycle, which was computers. And so they became the raw materials for the computers, which of course went through their own innovation. Now, we didn't need to get it so all three, you see all three again. And they went through the same cycle, but at the end of the day, what you had is the computers were now the empowered edge devices when the third phase, which is the third cycle of the internet, came on. And so then the internet moves from this establishment of the network, the next cycle is sort of reach, getting the web, World Wide Web. You're now getting the Web 2.0, which is a dialogue, which is just posting stuff is fine, to dialogue. And the net result of all of this has been to empower individuals at the edge of the network. First of all, the semiconductor becomes the basis for the computer, which becomes the edge device for the network, which becomes the basis for the two-way sharing of information. And his point is now, we're in the second phase of the 5th cycle, which is talking about Cloud 2.0. So Cloud 2.0 is instead of just posting information in the cloud, you're not doing processes in the cloud, you're not doing services in the cloud, and so on and so forth. And a really important thing here, and this is something I think he's missed, and we're going to have lunch on Saturday and talk about this, for Identity 2.0. So identity, I think, is really going to be essential to getting the effective use, utility out of all of the increasing network capability. Where this is moving to is basically straight through processing, transparency. You basically have information at the wall side. Right, whatever device you want to use, your computer, your handheld, your Google Glass, whatever, the information available to you in wherever form you need, backed up by enormous processing powers. But the identity is really crucial, because as long as somebody can be, masquerading as you, as long as you have this repeated succession of hacks and things like that, the trust in these networks is going to be always suspect. So the Identity 2.0 basically talks about each of us has a multifaceted persona. And so you replicate that persona digitally in some way. But then you only allocate information about that persona as in a role-based authentication. So if I go into a 7-Eleven and want to buy a beer, all the system needs to know is I'm over 21. It doesn't need to know my marital status, my bank account, my credit history, or anything else. Obviously, when I get access to highly classified information, you need more about you. So how do you then get this Identity 2.0, which is mapping your diverse persona into a role-based authentication? So I went and talked to one of the senior policy people on cybersecurity, and his point, yeah, Lynn, I really like that, but how do I authenticate your toaster? And so every year I go to DEF CON, the hacker convention in Las Vegas, and it gives me a chance to hang out with people who really think quite different than I do. It's from the and I came away profoundly depressed from this past August DEF CON, because I'd always sort of hoped in the computer security world that some combination of market forces, so insurance, slower insurance premiums for good behavior, corporate liability for bad behavior, would raise the floor of the information security picture such that you could get to a reasonable standard. Well, so what we're into now is something called the Internet of Things, and which I would actually argue is the cloud of everything, because the human body is becoming the platform. The Internet of Things is, the bus has an IP address, and so you can know when the bus is going to arrive at your station. Your car has all kinds of RF inputs in and out of it. Your dog has a chip. But everything has got an IP address and can be connected. But then, in point of fact, as I say, everything of the human body gets more and more to be a platform. So I think anything new in those who have iPhones or Apples, the iOS comes with this little help app. And so more and more and more, we're going to be getting data on our health, whether it's for your Fitbit or whether it's for your pedometer or whether what you want to do, can be collected and monitored and so on and so forth and stored. And the question is, all these data get gathered about you? I mean, which is actually more sensitive information to lose, having racy selfies of yourself posted on the internet, having all your biometric health data that is now stored in your device out there for people to use for whatever purposes. So with the Internet of Things, which is kind of where the world is going, part of it is incautious connections. Hey, hook your home security system to your cell phone. Not that. I mean, your cell phone is all sweet, heavy security, a 4-digit PIN, right? Or I just got a $100 router, and we'll hook all the city traffic lights to a $100 router. Who knows where it's made? I don't care. Who knows what the security is of it? So that all this functionality is being flung out there. The Internet of Things has no concern whatsoever for security. So all the efforts are being made on the corporate level to build this up are now just being completely undercut. The hack in terms of attack surface. The attack surface is just enormous at this stage. So again, here's this identity. I think this is a really, really major challenge to get to, increasingly the Internet of Things. But I think Coleman's model has been pretty good. 30-year cycles, 10-year phases, in general move to power of the edge network is something not bad. So what are some of the trends that are driving IT? There are really 6. You've got speed, you've got mobility, you've got commoditization, you have big data, multiple clouds, and this Internet of Things. We're moving from e-commerce to e-commerce. Online, Staples, I'm not sure Staples or Home Depot, will actually offer you a better discount based on your proximity to the competitor's store. So if you enable Google Maps to use your proximity, there are folks out there who know that you're actually within 2 blocks of the Home Depot, of the Office Depot, so I'll give you a 20% discount from Staples, 10%. How many of you know about cell phone externals? Okay, so about every couple minutes, your cell phone goes out and tries to check in with the tower, just so it's ready to call when you want to call. There are companies that go out there, companies out there that anonymize this and then monitor it. And so Nordstrom's can go out and say, on any given Wednesday in the women's department on the 5th floor, I have 7.3 customers who've driven an average of 4.5 miles a day, an average of 10.2 minutes. But if I offer a 25% sale, I'll have 10.4 customers who've driven 9.3 miles a day. So people say that for those of us who have more regular commuting patterns, that your cell phone externals is about as good a biometric as a fingerprint or a retina scan. But it also has other features like, every Thursday night you drive over to Salinas. Can you tell us what goes on there? Or, gee, here's this building around Washington, all these buildings where all cell phone communication is cut off at the door. You look at those buildings are more interesting to pay attention to than others. So there are all kinds of ramifications. So a couple of months ago, I got a call from CBS News. And CBS News was outraged that the Newark Airport had installed a new security system. And it was based on LED lighting. And because of the LED lighting, it was possible to much more precisely see what's going on in the airport. So you could track unattended luggage. Or you could see that security line 7 was longer than the others, so send people other security lines. It wasn't my outrage that this was a terrible violation of privacy. And my first point was, have you noticed what's happened to airport security since 9/11? I mean, the last thing I'm worried about particularly is LED lighting. But let's think about whatever your question about privacy. So what information are we sharing about ourselves voluntarily? So your Facebook posts, your LinkedIn's, your whatever. Then what information are we sharing voluntarily with companies through our corporate loyalty cards? I mean, Safeway knows everything we buy and whatever. And then what is happening to the information that companies are doing that we don't know about? You know, like data aggregators, or like the cell phone externals, things like that. And then what happens with malicious actors, whether it's hackers, or whether it's criminals, or whether it's aggrieved ex-lovers, or whatever, who go after your information. And now superimpose that, the emerging technologies, the ubiquitous of drones and autonomous vehicles, the linking, you say, of biometrics and bio and info and things like that. So my answer, frankly, was I couldn't get too excited about Newark Airport, but please think about the broader thing. And they say, hey, they'll come in where you spend 45 minutes talking about this. They'll call up a little later and say, oh, your segment's aired. So we aired the segment, and I got precisely 6 seconds. But it was actually not a bad 6 seconds, which was that be aware of what your data is, what's happening in your data, and be responsible for it. But so, again, all this stuff is happening. Commoditization, speed, mobility, movement to the internet of everything. And this just, we just need to understand how that's going to impact what we're doing. Particularly in this whole area of personally identifiable information. We had lunch the other day with some folks, and they were talking, one of my questions, what are you most worried about? And one of them said, it's actually the potential for future intimidation / blackmail by virtue of the accumulation of information that's gathered in us over our lives, whether we intend to or not. I mean, if you've lived in the digital world for 25, 30 years, you will have done something that you wish you hadn't done. And somebody's going to go out there and find that on almost everybody. And so that now means that somebody of malicious intent can go out and potentially say, if you don't do X, I'm going to do Y. Now, we had a discussion of dinner last night, and one of the discussions was, at some stage, people are just going to say, hey, forget of it. Everybody's got something out there about it. This is no big deal. You can't blackmail me. But other people can be. Will respond. And so the question is just, with all this stuff out there about everybody, whether you want to be known or not, the potential for leverage against individuals is just dramatically larger than has been in the past. From a military point of view, military is deploying tactical edge, these and the edge devices and tactical networks. Gives you vastly more capability than your military radios. But I don't know about you, but my iPhone doesn't have a lot of anti-jam capability built into it. And so we're introducing tactical vulnerabilities into the networks by virtue of this. Also, suppose we're all walking around in a few years with 4.5G edge devices and holographic displays, and half of us are wearing the successor to Google Glass turns out to be. Does our data plan become 100 bits a gigabyte? Where does the spectrum come from to support this explosion of mobility? So finally, on this part, at National Defense University, I usually ask, how many people here are under 35? And you just get a very small number of hands, comments we have, because students at NDU are typically in their 40s. So my question is, what do you know that we should know? And this Navy lieutenant stood up one time and said, so nobody in my generation ever uses the word cyber unless we come to a government meeting where you tell us we should use the word cyber. Well, what do you use? We're online, we're LinkedIn, we're connected. How does a fish describe the water we swim in? So the lesson for me is that just like naval operations are only a minuscule part of operations in the maritime domain, so transport and fishing and drilling and stuff like that, so are national security cyber operations only a minuscule part of operations in the information domain. And frankly, the vast amount of investment, innovation is occurring out there someplace. We come back to the point we made earlier, the governments, global politics, whatever, still think they're controlling this. And how do you square that circle and get to some kind of reasonable governance thing? So let me stop there for a minute. Thoughts? How much do you worry about privacy? Good.
I just wanted to support that point in an NPR discussion that we were having on the radio a while back. Someone actually called, there was cybersecurity, and someone called in, so what? Saying exactly that. So what if they just have my information? And someone had to explain to him, well, the problem if they have information about your bank is that, well, they might log in and take your money.
Right.
And it's gonna be a cost to you. But just beyond that, and I think that's at least my perspective as well, it's, in case someone's got my information, if they try to blackmail me, then I would have to just say, go for it, what do I have to do? I would almost try to find something to blackmail them.
Okay. This kind of goes back to Elizabeth's point earlier about, you know, what can leaders do to make their populations or their organizations aware of whatever the right level of threat is. I mean, the way to avoid cyber threats is you take yourself off the network, okay? But you suffer severe penalties if you do that. So what's the right balance between functionality and security and privacy and all that one too?
So I do value digital information, so I was just curious about your general thoughts on kinetic responses to cyber attacks.
Yeah, so one of the things that is increasingly aware, publicized, whatever, is the ability to do physical damage from cyber attack. There's a very interesting set of videos online that were taken a couple of years ago out of the Idaho National Engineering Lab of a generator that's tearing itself apart because basically somebody went into the machine control system and changed the pumping signal so it was 60 degrees out of phase with the rotating machinery of the generator. And in about 2 minutes, just things will blow up. And there are lots of things you can show about this now. And so, I mean, so one of the issues, and again, I'll refer Dr. Lochard on this in terms of what leaders have been thinking about and others, what's Article 5 or not, is the damage caused from cyber attack comparable to the damage caused by kinetic? Have you suffered loss of life? Have you suffered severe catastrophic loss to your critical infrastructure? So babies died in hospitals because the incubator stopped working, whatever. You know? So somewhere in that, so one of the things I was actually going to get to in the next piece is, did a book a couple years ago on cyber power and national security. And what they found was that there are 28 different definitions of cyberspace. And if you go and look at some follow-on things, there is no general agreement on what cyberspace is, except there's a general agreement about digital networks. And that's kind of one of the reasons why the talk here is about digital revolutions and global politics, not cyber revolution or whatever. So the common theme seems to be something to do with digital networks. How do you keep them running after disasters? How do you look at their influence on education and the way people think? How do you look at their ability to wage war and that sort of thing? So, so I think the answer is, to my knowledge, no red lines have been drawn yet that say, if you do X, then we will do Y. And you have hints at it in the North Korean attack on Sony and things like that. Maybe red lines were drawn, I don't know what they were. But right now, I think there's a lot of ambiguity in the whole thing. One, two.
I have a lot of questions, so I'm going to try to narrow
Go ahead,
down
sure.
exactly what we're talking about. And, do you feel like, or is it something that people talk about with the cloud and all of this? Is it almost, do you think it could be almost like the flying car, that a lot of the computing power is going to these server systems or these big computing centers, but with the doubling of computing power, that's going to go back out into our pockets. So because of spectrum, what can we transmit all the time, and the need to minimize like the digital coding. So there's a bunch of data, a bunch of sensors collecting all this data all the time, but do we really need a lot of this stuff? And kind of piggyback on top of that, there's some, I think it's Georgia Tech probably, some guys over there, they were able to, you know, somebody were using burner phones. And because we have potentiometers and sensors in our phones now, they could, even if you just picked up a random burnt phone, empty, with nobody associated to it, they could match that based on your walking rhythms.
Sure.
Basically,
You're right.
and things like that.
This comes back to the info integration.
Yeah. So I mean, like we've got all these things and all these sensors, and you know, for security stuff, we're leaving this trail, kind of.
Right.
Better or worse, and that's just in the U.S. or in the very Western, technologically oriented world. And there's so many communities that are just struggling to try to get some information, and try to get electricity so that they can, you know, they're not worried about if their connected toaster is secure. They're trying to get books and things like that downloaded through like OurNet and I don't know. There's a lot of questions, but it's dynamic. Where are we going? You know?
Yeah, so I think the answer is dynamic. So just, I mean, you look at the way the information revolutions moved come kind of from the big computers in the computer processing center where you carried your punch cards in every night and whatever. Then you began to get timeshare systems where you, and finally you moved to a client-server architecture where you have your PC and then you share things. Now we're moving back to the cloud and thin clients like Chromebook and all this where it's going back to the cloud. And then we've got, you know, these things, which, what is this going to look like with 10,000% more processing power in 10 years? And so there isn't going to be, I don't think, a clear movement one way or the other. Right now, it's going to be taking advantage. The advantage of the cloud right now, frankly, is it's not just, you're moving to things like information as a service. So instead of having just to run an app on your machine, you've got these really powerful things up there in the cloud that can do stuff for you. And so there's an advantage to going there. And then the point you made about spectrum is, okay, can you get there? If I'm a business and I want to run business continuity, what's the right balance between having my stuff in my home office, having some of it distributed away so if I get another, God forbid, 9/11 and my building is destroyed, I haven't lost all my data, but then how do I get the data back in terms of spectrum when I need it and things like that. So I believe there's not going to be any single answer. Dr. Bashar was telling me about Estonia is becoming a place now where more and more people are, or companies are looking to build big data centers and server centers because it's cold. You don't need to pay for air conditioning. And there's stuff going on in northern Canada and all sorts of places like that. So you know, this will be an evolving type thing. I don't think you're ever going to just cross the goal line and spike the ball and say we're there. So.
I had a question. You earlier you were describing overloading the generator, and that kind of classifies as a SCADA attack as opposed to cyber. And in the government or in the private sector, are they?
Well, I mean, SCADA is one network you attack through cyber.
Right, but in the government, are they kind of coupled together, or are they considered separate industries, if you will, in regards to policy, both policy and implementation?
Well, I think so. I think actually I'd separate a little bit differently. SCADA is sort of a generic term, supervisory control and data acquisition. It's the, you know, so in a pipeline, it's my valve is open, my valve is shut, my pressure is this, my flow rate is that. And because they're all connected to a computer, you can cause physical damage to these networks by telling the system that the valve is shut, the valve is open, so pump more fluid through it, and in fact it's shut and you overpress the COs and break the lines and things like that. So for me, SCADA is one target of a cyber attack, not really a separate class of things. There's a different area that people talk about operating systems and then machine technology, which is to say, okay, this generator, the way it attacked it is this particular way. That for me is a type of cyber attack, not a class. Okay, so I don't see this as the only way SCADA, I believe, comes to be a class among itself is that the damage is so widespread by attacking, say, the transportation data and calling all kinds of trains to crash and people be killed, that you have the ability to now say you've approached physical kinetic attack results through a widespread cyber attack. I mean, SCADA attack on the power grid, for example.
I guess I'm asking because it seems to be a different skill set if you're protecting the information versus protecting oil and gas facility, for example.
No, that's fair. But I mean, but it's always been. We spent a lot of time on this. I don't want to, but I mean, there's always been an issue of data at rest, data in motion. Okay? So if I want to steal stuff out of the bank vault and you haven't encrypted the stuff in the bank vault, if I can get through your server, I can take it out. On the other hand, if I want to disrupt your networks, that's a data in motion attack, and it's cyber, but it's sort of a different type thing. But it's still one type of a cyber attack. So I would say, yeah, this is one facet of a series of digital attacks that are often grouped under the term cyber. We talked already about the different functions of the cyber mission force. One is to keep the DoD networks operating. So that means you got to be skilled in making sure that the zeros and ones flow for your purposes, and you can defend the firewalls and defend the bad guys, keep the bad guys out, or at least minimize the damage. Another is protecting U.S. national critical infrastructure. That has nothing to do with operating the DoD networks, but it is a cyber game of offense and defense, just like something else. Another is going out and countering the enemy systems. So they're all part, to me, of a large integrated approach. So governance. Okay, so how does this tie back to governance and unpredictable conditions? How many have heard about wicked problems? Some. Okay. So back in 1973, so this is not a new term. Two people named Rattel and Weber wrote an article on wicked problems. And they had 10 characteristics. And first of all, there's no definitive formulation of the problem. So basically, a wicked problem is something where there's not only no definition of the problem, there's not only no solution to the problem, there's no definition of it. So you can have a simple problem, which is like building a Saturn rocket, which can be very complicated. But you know what you want to do. I want to build a rocket with this much thrust to take me there. And then you can have a complicated problem, which is, I know what I want to do, but I'm not quite sure how to do it. And a complex or wicked problem is one where, again, there's no definition of the problem, much less a definition of the solution. So, climate change would be one, terrorism is another, cyber in some respect is another. And typically a characteristic of a wicked problem is there are lots of different stakeholders. So, for example, there's, again, it's up on the website, the Cyber Initiative, a terrific report by the Congressional Research Service called Cyber Security Authoritative Sources and References, or where's that thing? And it lists from executive orders to laws to FCC regulations to corporate rules, just all hundreds of pages of what's out there. But one of the points they make is, when was the last significant cyber legislation passed in the United States?
70s, I think.
2002. The last significant cyber legislation was 2002. So despite all the things that have been going on, and one of the things that's interesting in this report is it shows in 2013 in the House, 11 different bills are introduced into 7 different committees, and 2 of them got out of committee and none of them passed the floor vote or something like that. And the problem is there are so many different stakeholders in this cyber piece that almost everybody has the ability to, if not carry their own ball across the goal line, block somebody else's. So that's one of the reasons why virtually nothing has happened. And there's a kind of classic case of wicked problems. So there's no stopping rule, no end state. Decision maker has no right to be wrong. But really importantly is a wicked problem is typically one facet of another problem. So anytime you go try to solve one thing, you change the problem. And what that means is your solutions almost always have to be iterative. You go forth and say, all right, I want to do X. But if in the military context, there's things called course of action. So I present the decision maker with courses of action A, B, C, and D. And decision maker says, okay, I'm going to do course of action B. What you should do for them is you should then keep courses of action A, C, and D on the shelf as what would be called branch plans. In other words, and you continuously evaluate, or you pick a time, 6 months, evaluate the assumptions that you had when you made the decision, and evaluate how things are going, and have a boss, going back into Elizabeth's question, a boss who's willing to come back and say, okay, tell me how things are going, and listen to the bad news if things are not evolving the way you expected to. And then have somebody say, really, I think course of action C is better than course of action B. So that means then the decision maker needs to get up and say, all right, based on reevaluation situation, we're going to do course of action C. The problem is that our political system rewards steadfastness and resolution. It does not reward iterative adjustment, you wimpy weather vaner. And so then as leader, how do you tee up the conditions for this? And one of the things is to say, when you announce your initial decision, based on the best information I have now, I am going to do X. And I ask all of your support team, let's go do X. But we also have built into this process in 6 months or a year or whatever, a review. And if the review suggests we need to do something differently, then we'll talk about it and we'll go do something differently. And that's not us being wimpy weather vaners, that's responsible decision making in a wicked problem, complex environment, because the things we've begun to do will change the problem and we need to see what's going on. So that's kind of, and it's a different governance model than a lot of people are used to. So Nancy Roberts, who's a professor over here at Naval Postgraduate School, has written a lot about this. And she talks about 3 broad strategies for governance of wicked problems. One is authoritative, appoint a czar. One is competitive, let the state and DOD duke it out. And the third is collaborative. And what she generally finds in her classes is she lets the students go out and find a problem, and solve a problem, try to solve a problem. And as she puts it, they almost always fail their way into collaboration. Because they'll start off by doing something authoritative, and that won't work, and then they'll start off by doing something competitive, and that doesn't work, and finally they say, gee, maybe we gotta work together on this. So the wicked problems literature is actually really interesting. So some of the lessons from real-world wicked problems course issues, again, getting back to your governance issue. Beware of attempts to tame a wicked problem. Taming a wicked problem is, okay, this is too big. I'm just going to attack this one little part of it. And the problem is it's all interactive. You can focus on this one little problem and find yourself with a little problem, but in point of fact, the bigger problem is still out there and you haven't really made as much progress as you think. You've got to find the way to get the whole system in the room. Who are the stakeholders? How do you engage with them? There's a great and troubling set of memos by a major from Afghanistan. He talks about the repeated failure of efforts in Afghanistan. And one of them was they got the different military, call them J codes, the J2356, so you got the intelligence people and the operators, the planners, the communicators together, and they worked on a solution. And it didn't work. So then somebody said, well, where was the State Department guy? Where was the AID person? Where was whatever? So I went back next time, so I got the state and AID and whatever. And it didn't work. So somebody, well, where were the Afghans? Where were the non-governmental organizations? Where were the whatever? And so it was just, the problem was they kept trying to solve the problem with too narrow a solution set. And in itself, that's it leads to a different problem, because you can obviously have, a committee of 172 that does nothing. So one of the challenges of leaders is how do you balance this issue of focusing on the right people with getting enough information to get the decision, the opinion sense. So the other piece is I just leave you with is set up a process to re-examine your assumptions frequently, periodically. So, okay, and that means you got to understand what the assumptions are when you go into a solution. If I'm going to decide X, what did I assume? I assumed that the Republicans and the Democrats would get along. Or I assumed that Putin would turn into a Jeffersonian Democrat. all right, or whatever it is, okay? So make sure somebody understands what those are so that in 6 months you can go back and say, didn't work, sir.
So I just wanted to go back to the interagency conversation.
Yeah.
How do you best deal with, for example, an allied nation or partner nations of the United States working interoperability with regards to information sharing? This particular ally does not possess the necessary capability
Right.
to maintain those sensitive information.
So one has to recognize, and in fact, we've had this conversation with a number of allies that are very, very close to us in many areas. In a networked world, a risk accepted by one is a risk imposed on all. And so if you cannot trust that ally to share the information, to protect the information, then I've been part of some very senior discussions at senior levels of government say, we're not going to share this with you. You are going to have to put more emphasis on your information security if you expect us to share with you. And in some cases it's worked, in some cases it hasn't, in some cases there are countries that are very, very close political allies that frankly limit the amount of information that we're willing to share with them just because they have not demonstrated this recognition of the seriousness of the problem. It's not an easy answer, but there's no point in, again, sugarcoating that. If they have sloppy information security solutions, given the ubiquity of the threat, given the fact that you know you have adversaries out there who are probing and probing and probing and probing, then are you willing to lose the information if you share it with them? That's the question. Sir?
Follow up on that. Are there any best practices? Are there any countries that are just really doing this better than others? And how do we, is there a process by which this difficulty of sharing is pushing people to best practices? Are there any countries that won't give the U.S. information because we're not good enough?
Oh, certainly. I mean, certainly, especially after Snowden. I mean, so the answer, I don't think I can answer that in this forum. I mean, there certainly are countries that do better than others. There certainly are those with whom we have very close sharing arrangements. I'm just not sure. I mean, Edie, is there anything in the, please?
Yeah, I'll dive in. It's a very easy question. So I agree fully that there isn't a lot of information sharing that's happening right now internationally. Part of the problem is, as you've heard throughout this past hour and a half or so, definition of cyber. What is an attack? What is an incident? What is a form of picketing or defacement? What is an act of war? What is simply, people talking or showing displeasure? And because there are no clear definitions by any standard, it becomes very hard to determine what part should be censored, what part should be made illegal, even within one country. So that's problem number one. Then you have that about 10% of the existing countries of the world have cybersecurity policies. That's it. We have a great map that MIIS done. Go to our website. It shows you can actually hover over them. It shows all the cybersecurity policies that actually exist. And so, and the reason is because everyone's trying to get their arms around it. There is no uniform definition of critical information infrastructure. Different countries have different definitions of what's critical infrastructure. So even there, you have also problems. Another issue that you heard two very different points of view. There was someone over there who said, I really don't care if my information is out there. That's actually a reflection in the real world, particularly Nordic countries, where I spend time. Very cold. Maybe that's why they don't get enough sunlight. But they can't. Yeah. There are very different views on privacy, where here in the US you hear a lot about the balance between privacy and security, like we were talking about the other day at lunch. Privacy and security, but in some of these other countries, they have decided that actually you have the right to information, that everything should be out there, and that it's wrong to hold anything back. Not just the contentious things about religious beliefs and, cartoons of, not that, but just information on critical infrastructure blueprints. Things that seem to be security concerns, but civilians feel they have the right to have all of that up there. So you have different points of views on that. And then you have the security concerns when you have an actual operation of how do these various countries actually protect their information, either the government or military itself, or the supply chain, the people that they outsource to, do they have enough protections there? A lot of the big data breaches that you've heard about, supply chain, it's not really the company in and of itself. So because of these complexities, and because those who have cyber capabilities, it's so highly classified that it's difficult to share information. That being said, there are information sharing platforms within NATO and some with Partnership for Peace countries. It works, but it's slow. It's not meant to be the first line. It takes the CERTs, the computer emergency response teams that I work with overseas. By the time they get the information that's trickled down, they already know it. What seems to be the most effective are informal networks, where people have worked together from one CERT to another. For example, the CERT in Estonia created the CERT in Russia, just so they would have someone to talk to, even though they're adversaries politically, the two countries. That doesn't mean that it's kumbaya and they love each other, but at least I've seen when I get my techie people together, or even my GAs, techie people, they don't care about the politics, they just want to do stuff. And I'm not talking about the hackers and black hat hackers and whatnot, but there's a different kind of information sharing, and there's been a lot in terms of partnership things that I've taken part in where you train the trainer, you learn from each other in non-classified ways of just how to do a tabletop exercise or how to start thinking through some of the methodology of red teaming and blue teaming so you can think about a problem. Things like that. But in terms of the actual information, and then the last point has to do with industry in terms of sharing, I would say, first, as Lynn said many, many times, industry really owns it. It's not really states that owns the information. Industry owns it. And they protect it because it's theirs. And they also can see an attack before anyone else. And certain big industries, choose to share information with countries as they wish. There's no law that regulates it. They can choose how much or how little, as long as it's a whitelist country, right? And that has raised a lot of questions of what does that mean? Or like the case I use a lot is Italy, because just in terms of how the cables are laid, happenstance or not, that's a question for debate, but the way the cables are laid, they see everything going through the Middle East and North Africa before anyone else, which is amazing, considering that region of the world. But that doesn't mean they're obligated to share everything that they see with everyone. And they don't have the capacity, they don't have the political will, maybe some things they want
and
to do.
not the governance.
Right, maybe they want to turn a blind eye, maybe they don't. But what their role is to protect their country. And so who's making that decision? Is it the person who happens to be looking at it? Is it how high up does it trickle? So from the international perspective, there is some, but it's just like a lot of what, everyone's struggling to get their arms around it, but there is some.
Lynn, as the host of this class, can I ask you a question which is somewhat philosophical, but somewhat is also because singularity is running so fast and the time is broken so fast. But I'm curious about 3 or 4 minutes of thinking about the following questions. Do you think it could be a possibility that a digital revolution, for the first time in itself, not just by its implications, could threaten humanity itself? In other words, the whole talk about the fact that we can transcend and create a situation in which the product of that ultimately could be some kind of threat to humanity itself. And this was even a subject in Davos of conversation recently. Do you take that question seriously? I mean, is it just a machine, or that machine ultimately could be something that could have some kind of will, maybe even political will, to the point it could be a really conflict between this product, the products of artificial intelligence, and human beings? Do you take this kind of semi, science fiction thing as something seriously that could be a threat?
So I'm actually not willing to rule it out. I don't think it's going to be in 20 years. But if you look at the Howard talk on learning machines and the velocity of learning machines, there's also a book called something like Learning Machines, Our Last Great Invention. which basically says at some stage it's taken to its limit, sort of artificial intelligence plus machine is to people as people are to cockroaches. You really wind up having more and more of the work. Essentially, people become the leisure class, if you will, and all the serious work is being maybe not the thinking by the upper 1% or those who really are able to dominate this, but for an awful lot of the things that we normally regard as us and things we do get replaced by automation. And what does that mean for people's interpretation of themselves? So just in a smaller case, the use of robotics in warfare. Okay. You know, since time immemorial, societies have accorded the honors of the warrior to people who have put their very existence on the line for the collective good. Right? Is that still going to happen if you're the controller of an unmanned vehicle? Or if you are, instead of going into the tunnel yourself to dig out the bad guys, you send in a little ground robot, things like that. It changes a whole lot of dynamics.
But my question is even stronger than that. My question is, do you think it could be at some point in the future, let's say within 50 years, that robots could have enough consciousness and enough will, political will, ultimately to be against human beings? I mean, that kind of questions that I don't know how to treat it. How seriously you treat that kind of questions in the range of 50, 70 years?
No, I absolutely would not rule this out. Right? I mean, just for example, the issue right now of how much autonomous capability do you give to a lethal drone, for example. I guarantee you we haven't come up with, I mentioned earlier, the legal, moral, ethical questions that this technology raises. And I think, for just as a simple example, the Aegis cruiser, Navy cruiser, has had an automated fire control system mode since it was first built in the 1980s. Right? So you put this thing and it tracks the target and it just makes the firing decision and shoots it down. Nobody I know has ever operated an Aegis in full automatic. But if the Vincennes had operated in full automatic, it would not have shot down the Iranian Airbus. Okay? So in that case, the people overrode the machine and the machine would have been right. Now, extrapolate that on, I don't know whether the machines all of a sudden say, okay, you know, we rule you aside. But the Air Force is dealing seriously with the question of man on the loop instead of man in the loop decision making. If you're going to defend a network and you wait for the network diagram to turn from green to yellow to red, you've lost. You have to be operating in that network at machine time. And that means you have to have given some kind of autonomous instructions, rules of engagement, if you will, to the automatic control system. And at what point do you not understand anymore what the automatic control system is doing? And I think we're not too far away from that. So does that imply a machine has will to, it's not too far away. If I don't know, if I'm a commander and I don't really understand how my lethal machine is working well enough to make decisions over what I do with it and just shutting it off, I think we're moving down the road to the kind of issue that.
Let's hope it's not hackable.
Of course it's hackable.
There you go.
Of course it's hackable.
So yes, humanity is in peril.
Again, I don't think it's not, nothing before these folks graduate. Maybe by the time your kids graduate.
Lynn announced about, Lynn announced about taking books.
Oh, yeah, there are a batch of publications over here. These are free for you to take if you'd like. Please feel free to